So it's not just the United States and Mexico, it's also China that you talk about. China is the primary source of fentanyl in the world. So fentanyl is an opioid that leads to 70,000 plus or minus overdose deaths in the U.S. every year. So reading from Wikipedia, quote, compared with heroin, it is more potent, has higher profit margins, and because it is compact, has simpler logistics. It can be cut into or even replace entirely the supply of heroin and other opiates. What do you think is important to understand about fentanyl as a drug?
There was a prescription opiate epidemic in the United States that kind of went down or stopped, or, still out there, but like the epidemic specific around it kind of petered out. And there was also marijuana legalization happening at kind of the same time period, which, people talking about marijuana legalization thought it was going to hit the cartels in their pockets and it was going to be like a death blow to these criminal groups. Well, now there's illegal pot grows in the United States being run by cartels in federal lands. There's the legal pot grows that are in some way, shape, or form influenced and or run or owned by some criminal groups that are kind of utilizing that. The marijuana fields in Mexico turned into poppy fields once again. The problem is that some of these lands were leached of all the nutrients and, they're not as good as something you would find somewhere in Afghanistan. So the yield and the quality of it wasn't as strong as it could be. So somebody thought about the bright idea of putting fentanyl into the mix. And not only that, but also figuring out how to get fentanyl into Mexico. Mexico has a giant pharmaceutical industry that people kind of also don't kind of know or factor into this equation, which leads into the free ability of chemicals going in and out of the country and legal means of it happening, right? So not only the precursors to make it, but also the chemist and the industry to create it in Mexico as well. Some clandestine factories of fentanyl have been found in Mexico, but realistically, it's not needed with the ways that the ports and the borders are down in Mexico. You started seeing an influx and a flood of fentanyl into Mexico, specifically related to infusing it into heroin, and not only using that to feed local drug markets, but send it up into the United States, which started off this process that we're kind of going through still.
Are these like similar highs? And drug-wise, why do you infuse? I mean, probably you're not the right person to have this biochemical discussion of how.
I don't know about the biochemical aspect of it, but like speaking to guys that do chiva down there, that's what they call heroin down there. It's like a nickname for it. Having them describe some of the older, stinkier, darker heroin they used to get before this whole fentanyl thing, and the highs they would get and how much they would have to take versus some of the stuff loaded with fentanyl that they have to, slow it down.
Also, there's more higher potency.
Yeah, there's a higher potency to it, and also there's
more money to be made, easier to transport.
Yeah.
But then, is this how China starts becoming part of the picture?
One aspect to it that people kind of miss is that, there's no Chinese cartel. There's no criminal Chinese organization working unseen, getting around government oversight in China. I don't know of any such organization.
Anything that could be labeled as a criminal organization is deeply integrated with the government. So it's.
I mean, I've never heard of a giant criminal enterprise in China operating. So we have to assume then,
independent of the state.
I would have to assume that some of these things are happening with the know-how and inaction of the government out there. When COVID hit, there was a shortage of fentanyl on the northern side of Mexico, specifically related to the Sinaloa cartel. These guys were actually trafficking fentanyl from the U.S. down to Mexico to infuse their product, but not the New Generation cartel, which operates out of the central part of Mexico, the Colima area, which have access to the seaside ports. So even during the shutdown, they were getting supplied, which means to me, at least, or for anybody observing it, that the supply chain was not cut. And whatever was coming out of China was being let out of China by whatever official channels would be able to shut down or stop it.
God, I would love to know the organizational structure, the governmental structure of China, how they enable it. Because I can't imagine at the very top, there's like a portfolio of things we're doing, and one of them is fentanyl, right?
I think it's more inaction, or just to know how that is happening, but just like hands off, just let this fly. I don't know.
If I were to understand how large bureaucracies work, it's looking the other way.
Yeah. You are now seeing pill presses brought to Mexico, industrial level pill presses found in clandestine laboratories, where they're not only infusing the yields that they're doing with fentanyl, but also making fake pain medication that is flooding U.S. markets everywhere. As far as, is that pain medication or is that fentanyl? Who knows? And that's how you see a lot of people dying from ODs that are supposedly taking pain pills, and that's not what they're doing. So the evolution right now you're seeing is making something look legit as far as a pain medication that it isn't. And yeah, I mean, fentanyl is everywhere. They're infusing cocaine with it. I've been getting stories from the US of people buying it through Alibaba or just weird online sources, and it coming in different packages, and they're just infusing it into whatever is out there. It is killing off a whole generation of people. And it comes from one place, or it's manufactured somewhere where it's being manufactured with the precursors and the elements and know-how that comes from one place.
Are we talking about China?
Talking about China.
Because Mexico seems to have, what's the role of, this is such a complicated, and how do you start to talk about the drug war when more and more and more China is the source of the drug? Is there a drug war going on with China?
There's probably an economic war. Well, there's another side to China. And this is something that's come out recently, a few years back, I think. But basically, the ways you would move money back into Mexico after you have a load up here is that you would give it to a Chinese money broker. Mm-hmm. They would put it into the Chinese banking system, and it immediately would just disappear from American eyes. And then another money broker in Mexico would receive it through a money transfer from China.
So China's incredibly good at money laundering.
That's another aspect to it. I mean, their banking system is invisible to the U.S., basically.
Which allows
the monies to move from one point to another. So money brokers and people moving money for the groups down there are Chinese. So that's another aspect or element of China as far as its presence.